Good morning, everyone. My name is Adekunle, and I'm a PhD candidate here in the Department of History. My paper is on the death penalty, which is one of the controversial topics when it comes to discussion of human rights and criminal justice globally. I picked this paper as an extract from my dissertation, which is on capital punishment in colonial West Africa, focusing on Nigeria specifically. And I thought about what the post-colonial era and the democratic era of the death penalty or capital punishment looks like. And I'll be looking at this across the retentionist and abolitionist context pertaining to the death penalty. Okay. Like I said before, the death penalty is one topic that has created global debates amongst international organizations, non-governmental organizations, human rights activists, and civil organizations, deliberating about either the deterrent effect of the death penalty in the 21st century specifically. And I would be examining the extent to which the democratic innovations and deliberative democracies reshape the death penalty discourse, as well as analyze the intersection of international advocacy and local implementation, and finally assess the effectiveness of these participatory processes, which I would expand upon in the course of this presentation. Next slide. For the purpose of this paper, the death penalty, the terms death penalty and capital punishment will be used interchangeably. For death penalty, it means the legal sanction permitting execution, while capital punishment refers to the broader institutional practice, which means that the death penalty could mean the action itself, and capital punishment could refer to the system of execution. Next slide. Yes, background. The death penalty remains a contested moral, legal, and political issue globally. And this rides upon the right to life, which is one of the fundamental human rights. In my perspective, I feel like the right to life is probably the most important right, because the absence of the right to life kind of zeroes out access to other rights. And that is why I'm of the opinion that this is very important. The ethical dimensions of the death penalty looks at the deterrence, the retribution, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and the sanctity of life. And that brings us to the two groups or two parties when it comes to discussions of death penalty. We have the abolitionists versus the retentionists. And these ideas kind of spill into their stance in terms of international advocacy and state sovereignty. And that's where I'm looking at both points simultaneously. For abolitionists, generally, they are of the opinion that life is sacred and believe in the sanctity of life and oppose the deterrent effects of the death penalty, and kind of support the idea that the death penalty is brutal and as such should not be implemented or carried out, not just in specific areas globally. For retentionists, there is a kind of a pushback where it's more of asserting state sovereignty. The idea that imposing abolition ideas or practices is more of an extension of Western imperialism. And for most of these retentionist countries or nations, there is that idea that they would want to assert their state sovereignty and implement their policies based on their own ideas without any external influence or inferences. And that kind of affects the extent of international advocacy and state sovereignty. Now, when we're talking about democratic innovations and participatory processes and people that, or systems, organizations that are advocating for the abolition of the death penalty, we see the pushbacks in the implementation or in the support of this participatory processes or democratic innovations. For example, we see international organizations and civic organizations kind of advocating and pushing for statutes, sanctions, instruments, policies that kind of promote this idea of abolition, or the fact that the deterrence effects of capital punishment isn't quite there anymore. However, for the retentionist, it is solidly based on the idea that they decide what works best for their nation and for their system and for their people based on their own lived experiences. And as such, would explore the democratic innovations that we have seen probably in the last century in the next slide. Yes, so the theoretical framework is kind of interesting because I tried to merge Mbembe's theory of necropolitics and Habermas's theory of deliberative democracy. For Mbembe, he talks about how the power structures or power systems kind of decides who gets to live or who must die. So it is not a probability, but a certainty, which gives such power or leaves such power in the hands of the elites actors in various societies. And because they possess these powers, it kind of waters down or spreads to the issues of death penalty. For example, in decisions when it comes to death penalty, we see how it is left in the hands of the executive, the legislature, who do not really have first-hand experiences of what the death penalty or capital punishment connotes. There is no involvement of victims' families, citizens, of activists, or people who understand beyond the theoretical connotations of what the death penalty or capital punishment is about. And that brings me to the other theory of deliberative democracy, which says that it is based on conversation and reasoning amongst citizens. So for the deliberative democracy to take place, it goes beyond having a democratic system of governance. It is not just about having these theoretical systems in place, but do we have the practical tools and instruments that ensure that discussions and conversations and debates regarding certain criminal justice issues are in place? Like Ross said in the previous panel about how the system and the personhood in systems is really not there. They do not have the conscience, unlike that in terms of persons and people. And that brings me to the issue of legitimacy through public reasoning and mutual respect. So he talks about how the legitimacy of a government, of a nation, could be attributed to the fact that it possesses public reasoning tools or platforms, and there's mutual respect and consideration of its citizens. And it encourages societies to deliberate ethically on punishment models and instruments. Next slide. Yes. For international advocacy and local implementation, we see, I've tried to break that down to show you those that are involved in the international advocacy and its local implementation. It is one thing for this instrument to be established. It is another thing for these instruments or policies to be implemented, or these mechanisms to be implemented. In some cases, it ends at the point of establishment or putting the systems in place, because there is always a pushback or resistance or refusal at the point of local implementation. And that brings to the point of debates on state sovereignty, on independence, on avoiding Western imperialist ideas, and that kind of affects the extent to which this mechanisms or instruments are finally implemented or successful in various areas. Most regional and international organizations drive the abolitionist norms, which we've seen through moratoriums, through treaties, through policies that have been in place, or as we're seeing now by the United Nations and even regional organizations across various continents. For retentionist democracies, they assert their sovereignty and resist this external pressure. Mostly, it is not really about resisting what these mechanisms tend to achieve, but it is more about who is proposing these mechanisms. And because of that, it kind of creates a gap in the successful or the potentials of these mechanisms in being implemented at a local level. So we see this advocacy projects and mechanisms in form of treaties, safeguards, doctrines, and other instruments. Next slide. Yes. So some of these mechanisms are discussed broadly in the paper that was submitted. And like I said before, we had moratoriums, which refers to the suspension of the actual execution or the practice of death penalty across countries. I don't know if some of us have read about the de facto abolitionist countries. Those are countries that for a period of at least 10 years haven't carried out executions in their particular areas or societies. However, it kind of gives a temporary situation because there have been tendencies or there have been cases whereby such states or nations go back and carry out executions, which kind of makes it a shaky ground for countries that take the de facto position. Another way we've seen how the ICCPR in Article 6, which is right here, talks about how every human being has the inherent right to life. And so the abolishment of death penalty is not only for the most serious crimes. And that anyone sentenced to the death penalty shall have the right to seek pardon, commutation of sentence. When it comes to death penalty, we see people who are being sentenced be referred to as condemned criminals, which shows like the finality of such crimes. It is like, okay, you've been condemned and that's the end of your life, which kind of takes out the place of pardons, the place of appeals, the place of the governor's ability to kind of revoke such sentences. We've also seen in the United Nations Economic and Social Council Resolution 1984/50. The paper has more details on that. And we also see retentionist reactions and rejections. Yes, this is also a form of mechanism or instrument when it comes to issues of death penalty. Colonial legacies versus state sovereignty. Like I said before, if you look at the states or the areas that are considered retentionist, most of them are riding on colonial legal structures. So we see that even in their post-colonial or even in their constitution, in their post-colonial societies, there are still inferences or traces of colonial provisions in their post-colonial laws. So we see how colonial legacies is still kind of visible in the implementation of the death penalties in some of these former colonies. However, for countries that colonized these areas, most of them have abolished the death penalty. So the question is, if those who introduced or have been considered to have introduced the death penalty into these colonies have recognized the not so effectiveness of this instrument or the implementation of death penalty, why do these former colonies still retain it? And that question can be answered on the stance of being sovereign states. So the idea that, yes, we've been colonized for so long, and at this point, we have the right to decide if we want to continue or if we want to stop. And the other points talk about local implementation in some countries like Malaysia and Zambia, and how effective reform emerges when global norms are localized through civic participation. And that talks about the importance of citizen involvement when it comes to decision-making, or when it comes to implementation, or when it comes to establishment or formation of certain laws as it affects the people. Democracy talks about government for the people, by the people, and of the people. But when the people are not directly involved in deciding what affects them directly, then that kind of creates an hierarchical system where these laws are just thrown at the citizens to kind of accept and assimilate. Yes. These are some of the mechanisms or instruments through which participatory process and democratic participation can take place when it comes to the death penalty. One is through moratoria, like I explained. We've seen that being implemented by the United Nations, by the HPR and the ECHR. We also see referendums, which kind of gives the citizens the opportunity to be involved directly in offering their opinions, their ideas, sharing their lived experiences, and that kind of forms a benchmark before decisions are made. So it doesn't just go from a point of this is what we think and this is what you have to do. But it goes from a point of this is what we think. What do you citizens also think about that? And forming opinions or getting to the decision-making process involves getting ideas from all classes and from citizens in general regarding their racial, cultural, social, or gender background. There are also deliberative forums. This could be in form of opinion polls. This could be in form of citizen assemblies that are also deliberative about ensuring that ideas or discussions or debates regarding the death penalty isn't just unilaterally decided by the political actors of certain societies. And that brings me to another instrument, which is the deliberative polling. And this is like an informed debate that ensures that stakeholders and people that are informed and have the necessary information regarding these issues when it comes to death penalty and its peculiarity across various states or societies or nations are brought to the table to kind of offer their opinions and ideas on how the death penalty or implementation of the death penalty should be carried out. Another one is the judicial activism. I attached the case here, which is kind of significant when it comes to the South African history of death penalty. So this case was in 1995. And if you kind of recall the South African history, just a year before, there was the implementation of the new 1994 constitution, post the apartheid era. And in that constitution, there was the loud vocal establishment of the right to life and dignity. And in this case, the two accused there were accused of murder and they were sentenced to death following the court's decision. However, they challenged the court's decision, citing that their right to life and dignity had been trampled upon or had been denied. And this kind of created a situation whereby the Constitutional Court also had to deliberate on that. And they came to the conclusion that, oh, most of the criminal activities or most of the judicial activities that took place during the apartheid era were kind of carried out unequally, or there were inequalities and there were biases involved in cases that happened during the apartheid era. And since this crime was committed during that time, they kind of found the loophole, and it was established in the Constitutional Court following various deliberations by the judges and members of the court that the deterrence effect of the death penalty had kind of lost its strength in comparison to life imprisonment, and that the death penalty was also trampling on the right to life and dignity. And on June in 1995, the death penalty was officially abolished in South Africa. So it kind of speaks to, for me, I kind of see this as a form of judicial activism, because if the judges in that court, or if the members of the Constitutional Court didn't see it fit to have a broader discussion on what the death penalty and its implications were as at that time, and looking at the peculiarity of the implementation of death penalty in that particular area, probably the death penalty will still be active in South Africa today. So that's a very valid model for participatory justice. We also see civic society organizations. We have the Amnesty International. We have the organizations that specifically work against the abolition of the death penalty. And they do this through grassroots campaigns, public education, legislative advocacy, and being involved in the direct activity of ensuring the abolition of death penalty. We see this human rights activist organizations going to prisons and trying to find a way to ensure commutation of sentences of those who have been sentenced to death, or even issues of miscarriage of justice of people who have been wrongfully accused and sentenced to death. So we see how civic society organizations also have a role to play in the participatory process. In conclusion, we see that universalism and the sovereignty tension that happens between former colonies and superpowers, international organizations in general, and these nations themselves, to push and pull when it comes to either do we abolish the death penalty or do we retain the death penalty? And the idea of the universal abolition without putting into consideration the unique features or dynamics inherent in various societies and nations. And it advocates for democratic innovations that foster dialogue, transparency, and accountability. And this can be done through rights-based participation that promotes humane justice system. And so we are saying that there should be more dialogue over decrees when it comes to discussions about the death penalty. Thanks. And I'll call my
Good morning, everyone. I think it's not 12 yet. Oh, well, it depends on what time zone we are in. Reimagining religious extremism in Nigeria, expanding, articulating, and correcting a globally held misnomer. Recently, I think Nigeria has been in the news once again for other reasons, especially religious extremism, fundamentalism, and criminality, generally speaking. Since I arrived, I've been answering questions about that rather than when I talk about, oh, I'm here in Canada to talk about reimagining religious extremism and to look at it from a more broader perspective. It seems as if people ask me, you are a Christian. For some of them too, they feel scandalized that you are a Catholic priest and you want to take the discussion away from Islamism. And I tell them that's not the point. The point is we want to talk about what happens and what's our lived experience. Now, on behalf of Chika Charles, who is unavoidably absent, my collaborator in putting together this document, I'd like to thank you for giving us this chance, this opportunity to speak about what we have lived over time. And next slide. The global idea of religious extremism has elicited a lot of reactions in different places. And then from 9/11 to the Sharia riots in Nigeria. And of course, 9 years after that, we had what we today know as the instability or insurgency in northeastern Nigeria, where Chika Charles worked for a very long time, doing the stabilization work for the United Nations. Now, after that, next slide, we see that with all that, there is an understanding that any time you hear of conflict or violence, that it had to do with something Islamic. And for us in Nigeria, our lived experience is that, look, that's not always the case, okay? We know that, yes, these have happened. For instance, now the conversation has been around Christian genocide. And the discussion we are having now is, should we use the word genocide, Christian genocide in Nigeria, or what exactly it is? The framing of the language has been a great challenge for us. So, or some have spoken about criminality. It's criminality because it's not just Christians who are targeted. There are also Muslims who are suffering. But I find sometimes the discussion tending towards, forgive me if I look at it from this angle, people are arguing, okay, there's a trophy for who has been killed the most. So are Christians the most killed or Muslims the most killed? And I tell them that that's not the point. If you go to the middle belt of Nigeria, Benue, Plateau states that have been in the news, you'll discover that those are predominantly Christian areas. And these communities have been targeted. That's true. But should we now have the discussion that it's a Christian genocide? That in itself is a different conversation. And I think it's this one will not be this discussion is not it's just coming in because that's what we're talking about. So because of what I just described, there is a tendency to only imagine such acts of violence of Islamism as the only forms of violence that we have. Incidentally, mainstream Western-oriented interpretations views neglect some of the activities of Christians who have openly called or described others outside of their own system as people who deserve to be conquered or people who must be converted. And especially in the southern part of Nigeria, you have seen where Christian groups have attacked those who are indigenous African traditional religious adherents. They've been attacked on some occasions. Some of them have been dispossessed of their lands. So, and we see that as a misunderstanding of what extremism, religious extremism should be about. Next slide. So now of course, the data collection has been what we've done, the work that we've done. I lived in Northwest Nigeria and eventually went on, but I don't know how it happened, but I became enchanted by Islam and then the Arabic language. And although I'm originally from Southeast Nigeria, so we're like poles apart, but I just got enchanted, and that drew me into looking at the religion itself and what we could do. And having worked in that area, and Chika Charles as well, having worked in the Northeast, also gained a lot of experience in doing the work. Now, our main argument is a reframing of and the understanding of religious extremism in order to imagine a concept, to reimagine a concept commonly held. This is also to include other groups who have indicated not just a tendency to violence, but also have carried out acts of violence and dispossessed people of their lands, destroying shrines, and making them feel like a kind of an exclusionist uh, uh, tendency that has created more problems within the communities. Now, this conceptual and theoretical framework that we have, the theory of social construction of reality, by Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman, which seems to posit the abnormal extreme behaviors as becoming normalized. And for the Nigerian context, this is due to local perceptions influenced by global narratives. These often align with interests of social and political landscape, the media, and security paradigms that serve to reinforce local dominant power structures. These have not been helpful, and that has been a great challenge. Now, we also have Edward Said's concept of the other that has now objectified extremism as something imported, something foreign. So in the southern part of Nigeria, when you're talking about religious extremism, they tell you no. For instance, when I engage people in interreligious dialogue, actually, that's where I'm working for the Bishops' Conference of Nigeria, Catholic Bishops' Conference, as a director for dialogue, interfaith dialogue, and ecumenism. So when I call people from Southeast Nigeria to come, let's talk about dialogue. They tell me, no, dialogue is something for northern part of Nigeria, where you have Muslims. So if you want to do dialogue, go that way. And my question to them is, but you have African traditional religions adherents who are with you in the South. So what do you do with them? So that in itself has become a great challenge in having that. So they see this idea of religious extremism as something of the other people and not of themselves. Next slide. Now, the religious idea of cosmic confrontation or war, as Regilme theorizes, sees a fusion of religious language in political and social endeavors, where community identity and state power are rooted in religion. This, as we say, is very potent in Nigeria, religion and politics. Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka wrote his thesis. He put forward, he says, power and politics in northern Nigeria. And with that, he exposed the intertwined relationship. And for the northern part of Nigeria, they can't see themselves outside of the equation of political power, especially with their religion. And that in itself has been a great problem. But so it is in the southern part of Nigeria too, where when you talk about a Muslim, they quickly look at you as you seem like somewhat from somewhere else. You are foreign to this part of the world. Now, global narrative of religious extremism, indeed, refers to beliefs and practices that go beyond normative religious teachings to justify or promote radical ideologies, often resulting in violence, intolerance, or undermining pluralistic societies. Every religion has a tendency, because of our exclusivist ideas and our projections. Please, next slide. Now, the thrust of our discourse continues to talk about failure in the political and socioeconomic policies responsible for the gaps. Because at the end of the day, what are we talking about? What is the issue? Religious fundamentalists, they see rito-theological adherence as stopgap mechanisms for dealing with the failures of governance. Now, as a Catholic priest, when I talk about governance, people regularly ask me, but you should be preaching in the church. What are you doing here? This is not your field. And I readily ask them, well, that's good. But in our own typical area in Nigeria, where governance is just at the top level, there's nothing at the grassroots. The three tiers of government, the federal, state, and local, the local governments are just on paper. They are non-existent. The structures are not there. So you'll discover that the people who provide what the government should do, if somebody is lacking in school fees, they need scholarship, they want to go to school, they don't see the members of parliament or any other person. The first point of response will be the priest or the pastor or the imam in the community. So at the end of the day, so why are you not accepting that I, even as a religious leader, have a role to play in governance? So there is something that's an idea that we are trying to get people to understand, that there should be an identity that brings us together, not because I am in government or out of government. In Nigeria, various groups have propounded principles of religious followership to respond to the myriad of challenges facing the country. People have taken up apocalyptic and demonological worldviews. Pentecostal Christians have contributed, seen polarization, that have seen activities turned violent in search of purification of communities from demonic forces that they feel have not allowed the progress that everybody desires. Oftentimes, we also see that the people who are adherents of African traditional religion have been the victims, because there's, oh, you are the ones who are not part of this religion. You are not a Christian, you're not a Muslim. So you are actually part of the demonic forces that have held us back. And that in itself has been a great challenge. Now, in the same vein, practitioners of African traditional religion have alleged that socioeconomic challenges abound because foreign religions have come in and not allowed them to live according to religious tenets of the communities. And sometimes they have turned violent, they have imposed curfews, and they have told people you cannot move out. And that in itself has become a challenge. Well, I think this is where I also want to bring the next, well, let me not get ahead of myself. The nexus between democratization and the discourse about the religion and its presence in our communities. Now, another factor which is remote is the drive to occupy the center stage in the political and economic arena. The drive to control these spheres have contributed in very many ways to the crisis. It's often said that he who controls the economic base determines the political structure. And in very many cases in Nigeria, for instance, the idea is he who controls the political structure determines the economic base. So people are looking, it's more or less access to funds, access to wealth, access to power. And the power is not just political power. Political power gives you access to economic power as well. So this has taken a religious dimension because the people who are part of these have religious affiliations and they command their allegiance and control. This has very serious political and economic consequences, especially where minorities live within a larger group. If you are not part of the establishment, you are cut off. And that in itself has continued to be a challenge. And all these maxed around religious extremism, these actions lead to shrunken spaces and socio-political and economic exclusions. The actions that constitute various forms of religious extremism outside of Islamic extremists have been overlooked by many scholars. And that takes us to the blind spot in scholarship. There are many people who don't see, I'm not saying that we don't have Islamic extremists. There are. In fact, depending on where you are, they seem to be dominant in some areas. In Nigeria, for instance, they are more dominant in the north. But in the south, we have a more liberal approach, yes, but there are some persons who still believe that if you are outside of Christianity, you don't have to partake. Or even if you may be a Muslim, they would rather accept a Muslim, but traditional African religion adherents, they are looked upon as people from outer space. They are just not part of that community. So many have not really considered the harsh and violent treatment meted out on ATR adherents in some parts of the country as effects of religious extremism. They tell you it's not. We are being missionary. We are being missionary for some of these people. I've had a conversation where in the southwest of Nigeria, where a Muslim group would rather talk to Christians and have a dialogue with them, but people who are practitioners of African traditional religion, they tell you no way. They can't sit down with them. The Christians even are able to sit down with African traditional religious adherents, but the Muslims won't have that. And that has been a major challenge. So Christian programs mostly tied to the Crusades. Well, probably with the mind of the year of the ancient crusades, have become some kind of an albatross over the heads of those who relegate religious violence to some extremists. And that has become a big challenge. So who are the extremists? Who should be at the table of the discussion? Who should be part of this discussion that we're having for the growth of the community? Next slide, please. Now, in conclusion, our need to broaden our recommendations, the need to broaden conceptual definition of extremism that transcends Islamism, perhaps something like the pursuit of religious purity or dominance through coercive and exclusionary means. And for us, this is very strong because people who carry out these things in themselves have become extremists in their religious views and have not allowed others to thrive as well. To expand the concept of religious extremism to capture non-Islamic forms, Christian and ATR actors also engage in extremist behaviors, but this insight should be more systematically framed. It requires more, if you like, further dialogue. Then current countering violent extremism and peace-building frameworks, largely state or donor-driven, have failed to recognize plural forms of extremism. And we are hoping that such inclusion and further dialogue will help to reframe and reimagine what it means to be a religious extremist and to help to build a community. And finally, a reframed CVR approach grounded in inclusivity, local religious dialogue, and recognition of freedom of religion and belief across all traditions will go a long way to improve the relations and build communities, not just in Nigeria, in Africa, but around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have enough time for questions. So if you have any questions, please, let's start. Questions, reactions, comments? Okay.
Sure. Just on something you recently said about who are the people who need to be at the table, these dialogues, and considering the challenges that you've stated, like they won't engage with each other. How would, let's say, practitioners or someone who's going to organize a dialogue approach that from the ground level?
Well, I would say that, yes, it's difficult. It's been a difficult one and it's been quite challenging. But I know that there are others too who are open to have such conversations. What we need to do and what we are doing now is to identify these key persons because we believe that they should be at the table and let's have a discussion because having interfaith dialogue, mainstreaming interfaith dialogue in community development and growth in itself has got a lot of positive aspects that can help grow the community. So that's its form of engagement and dialogue never ends, the discussion never ends in having that.
I really appreciated both these presentations, and I want to come back to the death penalty. But just while we're on this religious extremism, I really like this invitation to kind of rethink what we mean by religious extremism, and a couple of thoughts came up as you were presenting it. So part of the problem is that we're looking at it, the Western gaze, let's say, sees Islamism as the more extreme. But I feel like the whole concept of extremism is kind of a Western concept. The idea that we should be secular first. That any form of religion is kind of almost by definition extreme. So, how do you distinguish between, like you use the concept of religious purity, but how do you distinguish between sincere adherence to religion and extremism? And I wonder, so if you take Buddhism, for example, or Jainism, or forms of Christianity that are very pacifist in their orientation, if you are extremely committed to that religious conviction, wouldn't that be actually a good thing? Like, how do we, calling extremism itself kind of a bad thing? I wonder if that's, how do we distinguish that from sincerity?
Well, in my own, from my studies, what I see is extremism is extreme, but fundamentalism may not be extreme. So you may be a religious fundamentalist, sticking to your principles, your beliefs, but not be extreme. If you ask me now as a Catholic priest, if I was to talk to you about the Eucharist, of course, that is basic. And for me, that is, I can't trade that for anything. But again, I would not say that anybody who is not a partaker of the Eucharist in the church is doomed, so to speak. I may not take that position because at that point in time, I'm speaking about my belief. And that's what I believe. I believe in that's what sustains me. Now, if I also would, there's also talking about the dignity of the human person. You rightly spoke about that when you made your presentation. Dignity of the human person, the principle of the common good. These are principles that, if you like, every religion, let me say Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, for instance, hold these principles. Okay, but to what extent do we leave it out? The problem we have, for instance, in Nigeria is that everything is a mix. We tend to cloak everything under religion. But meanwhile, as you rightly pointed out, the distinction between ethics and government or political philosophy itself has become a great challenge in helping to place that balance. So people know when their religious fundamental beliefs, okay, should guide them, but again, allow other people to live out their own fundamental beliefs. So for me, that's my own way of putting it. It could be a subject of more further discussion. You want to talk about that? No.
So from speaking from South Asian experience, the way we look at religious extremism is not really the part of the debate. It is framed from religious fundamentalism, but the understanding of fundamentalism is which is very narrow. So religious fundamentalism in public discourse will basically mean a fundamentalist view of your religion, which also allows you to use violence against the other, whosoever the other could be people from your own community as well. And this definition is far more popular because you would have Shia Sunni problem in Pakistan, you would have Hindu fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism in India, you would have Buddhist fundamentalism in Myanmar, and Sinhala and Buddhist sort of problem in Sri Lanka. Sadly, all of these communities have diversified the understanding, and it has taken away the focus of Islamophobia from only tagging it to Muslim, but it has also complicated the understanding. So the understanding that we have of the extremism that we are talking about is more wrapped in the envelope of religious fundamentalism, but a very, very narrow definition of that, vis-a-vis whether you justify the violent methods towards the other, whomsoever you think the other is. Would you like to sort of comment on that?
Yes. What I would say is that religious fundamental, for instance, from the definition, trying to go to the roots of being a fundamentalist, it really talks about you knowing and identifying with the roots of your belief. So if I am a fundamentalist, I won't waver, or I'm not wavering on the basics of my belief. Now, where that is distinguished from extremism is when you move and your right to practice what you fundamentally believe now begins to dictate how you perceive the other person, and not just perceive the other person, but you go ahead to prevent the other person from practicing their own faith as they believe fundamentally. So in my own opinion, in my own view, that in itself is, that's what takes it to religious extremism. And if you consider the communities you've mentioned in South Asia, Buddhists, and recently we never really heard of Buddhists taking up becoming very violent. Even in Nigeria as well, we never really knew the adherents of African traditional religion becoming violent. And in my own case, I think from my own observation and from the studies I've done, I've seen that, and from my own lived experience, I've seen that the lack of consequence in the Muslim extremists who have destroyed churches, killed, killed and maimed people in the north, because there's no consequence to that. The people in the south, especially African traditional religion adherents, are saying to themselves, well, we've always been here. So I think we should be the ones to decide the pace of how people live their own religious beliefs in our own locality. So by the time they move from the basics of their belief to talk about preventing the other person from living out their own religious beliefs and convictions, they have gone to the extreme. And that in itself has moved them from being just fundamentalists. I think when you involve violence, when there is violence, that has become extreme. So that's my own understanding.
And Melissa?
Thanks, Oli. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentations. I have a couple of death penalty questions. Okay, you from religion, so so thank you, excellent presentation. And I was thinking as you were speaking, if there was a relationship between if there's death penalty on the books and extrajudicial killings. So if there's a legal framework, do states not invoke kind of extrajudicial stuff? I don't know if there's work on this, but of course, then the two examples that popped into my mind are, kind of the US and Israel, and one has a death penalty, one doesn't, and they both engage in, extrajudicial killings. So I don't know if there is any relationship, but if you have any insights into that, great. And the other thing is on the polling and the South African case. What's so fascinating is that by the time 1999 elections came along, I was doing polling in the ANC. And we made an anti-democratic decision to exclude the death penalty and abortion rights from our polling because we were worried that a populist in our organization might take it on. Because by that time we knew that the majority of people were in favor of the death penalty and against abortion. Yeah. So, so in that case, so polling obviously as a quantitative technique is deeply problematic, but I'm so fascinated by your idea on deliberative polling. So if you could perhaps say a little bit more about that, I'd be really interested in how that works.
Thank you so much. To your first question, when it comes to death penalty and capital punishment and execution, there are very dimensions and ways by which you would see them being implemented or being executed. So yes, for extrajudicial killings, there is literature, and there are also examples, and there is also the connection between death penalty and extradition. It's like one executions, and then we talk about secret executions, we talk about public executions. On when we talk about the death penalty, and so people think that the death penalty and mob justice, or what we call jungle justice in Nigeria, which is basically the people taking laws into their hands. So for example, a typical case in an urban city like Lagos in Nigeria, probably someone steals and the person is caught. The first thinking by the locals or people on the street is to get like a car tire with like a fuel, gasoline or whatever, and set that person on fire, which is to pass judgment right on site. But the difference between that and the death penalty is illegality involved. So there is a legal sanction that takes place when it comes to death penalty. For example, there is the court, there is the involvement of the court, involvement of the prison, before the final sentence of yes, you've been found guilty, and then you are now a condemned criminal. And that's when I spoke about the identity of people sentenced to death as being condemned. Yes, we still see that on the street when it comes to like mob justice, or the jungle justice, where people take laws into their hands, or the citizens take laws into their hands to kind of pass judgments and kind of do that. And also for like extra, speaking broadly, when it comes to like secret executions or public executions, that's also another dimension of debate where people say, oh, executions should be carried out publicly so that the deterrent effect is more pronounced. So when people see what can happen to you if you commit a crime or a capital crime, then you will probably not commit that crime. But we have also seen cases of celebrating criminals. So the celebrity status of some criminals where they want that kind of popularity or that kind of status. When we are talking about popular Nigerians that are sentenced to death, most Nigerians or that are familiar with the subjects and think of names of people that are sentenced to death or executed just because of the publicity that goes into execution. For example, in Nigeria, in the mid-90s, 1990s, during the military era, there was something known as the Babbage killings or the Babbage executions, rather. So the Babbage is like a prominent beach in Lagos, Nigeria, and that place kind of moved from being an entertainment or relaxation spot to kind of a place for execution. Firing squad, yeah. So what will happen is that for during the military era, when people were found and sentenced to death, they will be brought to the beach, which is known as the Babbage, and they will set up poles with like a drum with sand and tie these criminals to it. And we have like military officers who would execute these criminals right in the public space. And then the crowd, that is the typical people who would come in, citizens who would come in to kind of watch how life is kind of shuffled out of these condemned criminals. So like I said at the beginning, this is kind of connected to my dissertation. And I was in Nigeria about 2 years ago to carry out like research and field study. And I was able to interview someone who experienced the public execution when he was 9. And the thinking was, oh, one, why would your parents take you there to kind of, so it was not like, oh, this is what will happen to you, you grow up and become a criminal. So it was also traumatic for someone 9 years old having to have experienced something like that. So now think about beyond children, think about adults that experience that, and just the showcase and just the severity that goes into such public executions. And now we also have discussions about secret executions where it's like, why are you executing people without the knowledge of maybe their family members, and people don't know exactly what is going on. So the discussion is various dimensions, whether it comes to the actual execution, whether it comes to abolishing it generally, or the method or modalities of execution.
Thanks, both of you, for interesting papers. My question is for Oyinade. And thought that when you were talking about the abolitionist movement, that you were kind of rooting it in the ethical arguments against the death penalty. But at least in the United States, there's also a significant, more economic argument that's made about the death penalty. And I'm interested both in terms of how common that argument is beyond the US. And then also, and then how does that perspective can fit into your model?
Thank you. Yes, that's interesting to think about. Looking at the economic variations or understanding when it comes to death penalty, it has to do with one, the actual execution, the cost of the actual execution. In some countries, they don't have the lethal injection as a mode of execution. They use probably the go-to or the most common is death by hanging, where they are executed in the gallows, the region of it. So when it comes to like the expenses involved in the actual execution for countries that maybe use like lethal injection or electrocution or more sophisticated ways of carrying out execution, it's a concentration for it. Also, in terms of prisons, and that's why I mentioned that for every society, or every nation, every country, it's they kind of have a unique situation or have unique lived experiences. So it is not a one-size-fits-all. So you can't say because this is applicable in this area, so it should be applicable in this area. For example, in terms of prison systems, we have some countries that when thinking about economic dimensions of death penalty, they think about, oh, if we keep these people in the prisons, then we have to think about their basic needs, feeding, clothing, health, and everything, which kind of takes from the funds that could be deployed to other things. Now, this is someone that's been condemned. Now, I'm looking at it from assumption. This is someone that's been condemned. You've been condemned means finality of life. So why postpone what is inevitable and just take such people out? That way you're kind of saving some funds or prison funds when it comes to like taking care of the prison population. There is also the issue of overpopulation in most prisons, and that's been the argument for people who are kind of like, yeah, let's retain the death penalty. Why? Because the idea is the overpopulation of these prisons kind of makes it inhabitable for and makes management of such prisons kind of tricky. Again, during my interview period, I was able to interview the Control General of the Kirikiri prisons, which is one of the maximum prisons in Nigeria where condemned criminals are kind of kept. And during the interview, someone walked in and was like, oh, you have to just keep quiet or switch. And I was like, okay. And then when the person left, the person came to fix something like did like an electrical work in his office, and the person was like, oh, that is one of the condemned criminals. I was like, oh wow. And he spoke about how they also deploy funds to kind of ensure their education, ensure they have skills, make sure that they are the most taken care of set of criminals in the prisons. Because if they don't do that, there is the mental, where they also have to provide psychologists to kind of make sure that up here, they are okay. Because you never know when the actual execution will take place. So when it comes to the economic dimensions of whether you abolish or you retain death penalty, they think about these things. Cost of maintenance, the recurrent expenditure or expenses that goes into either retaining it or abolishing death penalty. Robert?
Oh, yes, well, thank you for your excellent presentation. Because I study juries, and juries are an ancient form of citizen deliberation.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about, and because many of the nations that you're studying are former British colonies,
Yes.
Who in some instances imported the jury system into the legal system. Legacy of colonialism, it's not complete. So is there citizen deliberation in the form of juries that is part of the death penalty process, the adjudication process? And if so, what's your assessment of the quality of that deliberation? To what extent does it meaningfully insert the will of the people into the process? What's your assessment there?
Okay, thank you. When it comes to like the jury system of consideration, in terms of decision making or judgment in death penalty in criminal or capital cases, it varies. What it is more of a recommendation whereby their ideas or what they have to say is just recommended to the judge or whoever is in charge of the court. So it's left to the discretion of the judge to say, okay, I'm going to take this other advisement or not. So for me, I think that has a twofold effect. One, it could kind of discourage the members of the jury to continue to recommend or suggest or advise, especially in cases where they feel that they are not being heard or they are not listened to, or whatever they're recommending is not taken into consideration. That's one. Two, it could also work where they are listened to and their advice is taken under consideration, because members of the jury are citizens, people are at the level of communication with other citizens. So they are well aware of what it takes or what needs to be in place, rather than just having the theoretical policies or systems that are in place. So yes, the jury system in some places, the effectiveness or the success kind of depends on the personality and the reaction of the members of the court.
Thank you.
In your classification of abolitionists versus retentionists, how fluid are those classifications? Are they strict? Because you just talked about conditions in the prison and everything. Now, I'm a board member of a abolitionist organization that both against the death penalty and both against prison system. But we also know that these humans are caught up in that, and we have to make sure that they are treated as humans as much as possible while we're trying to get rid of the systems. So how fluid or how concrete are those classifications?
To borrow the words of someone I know who is in this room, the pendulum is not swung to the extreme. So it is not like an extreme case of abolitionists versus retentionists. If you remember, I spoke about like the de facto abolitionists and the idea of okay, this is the temporary fix of let us abolish it or stop this for now and see what happens. And the de facto abolitionists are those ones that do not, although they still have it in their constitutions or in theory, but they do not practice it for at least 10 years. So that kind of gives like a breathing space within 10 years or longer, kind of put systems in place that ensure the eventual abolition of such policies. Also, when it comes to the abolitionists versus the retention, there have been ideas and recommendations for abolitionists. If you want us to abolish this, what do you recommend as the alternatives? For retentionists, okay, yeah, so we speak here, is it the deterrent effect? Are we seeing that as it is successful, or is it still successful even in the 21st century? And we've seen recommendations from the abolitionists saying, why not move or tilt towards life in prison? And that's another issue which we spoke about overcrowding and the prison system. And for the for the abolitionists also saying that the deterrent effect is really not there. In my presentation, I spoke about the ethical dimensions, which is deterrence, rehabilitation, reconciliation, retribution, incapacitation, and finality of life. So we see across these dimensions, whether we are suggesting that, okay, the deterrent effect, whether we're looking at retribution, whether we're looking at incapacitation, or do we kind of rehabilitate these people rather than just denying them their fundamental right to life. So it is not like an extreme case of abolition versus retention. There are instances where there's like the kind of back and forth.
I know we're at the buzzer here, but I just have a question about this death penalty issue as well. And it felt to me like you were, when you were talking about the colonial and post-colonial comparison and saying that countries that are closer to the colonial system have more death penalty, more deaths, they use the death penalty more. That seemed a little surprising to me. because maybe it's because I've been reading Maritain, but the French Revolution and the Revolution leads to a lot of chopping of the heads.
Yes.
And in the American continent, the three countries that were least revolutionary, Canada, Costa Rica, to some degree Chile, but Uruguay, they were the first to abolish the death penalty, and they're the least willing to use state power in a revolutionary sort of way. There's something about that zeal of the revolution. So does that square with what you're saying? It felt like it's a little different.
So what I was trying to say, or what I'm trying to say, is that for former colonies, most of the retentionist states are former colonies. That's what I'm trying to say. Most of them are former colonies. And what I was trying to say is that in this post-colonial era, or in the 21st century democratic, if we look at the abolitionist states or countries, we see that these were the so-called people that introduced the death penalty. Let's say, for example, Britain, and in the British colonies, former British colonies was Nigeria, former British colonies was Ghana, and for countries that still retain that, the idea, okay, we see cases of like voice pops or like interviews. So during my interview, I was able to interview people across the board, age, gender, social class, and that maybe includes like a 90-year-old man, students, women, even former military officers that were involved in like the firing squad era thing. And listening to them and asking like, oh, are you for or against death penalty? And listening to their various views, and some saying, oh, we shouldn't abolish it just because the British or the United Nations say we should abolish it. So they attribute the United Nations and international organizations to Britain, to the former colonial power. And they are not really, and if you listen, you see that they're not really looking at the mechanisms or the instruments being introduced, but rather at the personality introducing or suggesting. So I think it's more of like colonial thoughts, of like, oh, this is what they did to us, so they can't tell us what to do. We are free now, we're sovereign now. And that's what I could get from the conversation. And another thing is for those that were like, yeah, we have to abolish it. It was more from like the religious sentiment, moral, and saying, oh, they've committed the crime. There's nothing you can do that could, if it's in case of murder, bring the person back or whatever. So we were not saying free them, but we could maybe convert it to like life in prison rather than taking their lives. And also the sentiments of miscarriage of justice. And what if there have been cases where people have been executed and they were innocent? So can you bring them back once such error has been carried out? So what I'm saying is that these former colonies in the 21st century that still retain it, they are not really retaining it because they just want to retain it and see that, oh, it's more effective, the deterrent effect is there, but because of the personality that is introducing a contradictory idea, or the personality that they attribute such ideas to. And it's more of like, and still kind of finding little ways, or not so little ways, to assert their freedom, their sovereignty, and independence. Yeah.
The revolutionaries.
Yes. Okay. Yes, some questions.
I was going to ask a question. No, I had to ask her if one of the panelists could ask a question.
Yeah.
So concerning the death penalty, it's quite remarkable that you've mentioned, or your discussion is around at this modern times, those who have been how did you put it now? The colonialists?
Yeah.
Okay. And those who have been, for instance, in Nigeria now, when we're talking about the death penalty, people not signing up for the abolition of the death penalty, is it more about they still believe that there is the consequence? So the idea of retributive justice rather than restorative justice.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
so it's like they see it that no, they should be, because they should be punished. They're looking at the environment and they're saying to themselves, well, if you abolish it, it's like a free for all.
Yes, yes.
In this climb where we have not risen to that level of conscience and social responsibility and accountability. So they see it as retributive. So it should be there rather than restorative, as we talk about in the, if you like, in the global north. Okay, we need to get these people reintegrated in society and all that. So, and which also affected in the northeast when former fighters of the Boko Haram, the insurgents, now were brought back, and the communities were urged to accept them because they wanted them to be reintegrated in the community, saying, "Oh, they are your sons. You should take them back. They're your daughters. You should." And the persons are saying, "But I can't." The more we see them, others are likely to join because it became very lucrative. It was said that the military got paid like $1,000 for a month for being part of being part of the military, okay, fighting the insurgents, but the insurgents got like 6,000. So it's like, it's more lucrative to be part of the insurgents. And that, if you like, push and pull factor all around has made many persons to say, no, let's leave the death penalty because it's part of the retributive justice system.
Yeah, it's more of like the concept of an eye for an eye. So if you kill, you should be killed. And I remember asking someone like, "Oh, so what do you recommend to replace the death penalty?" And the person was like, "Oh, the death penalty is still in place and crime is this high. So if you take out the death penalty, what's going to happen? It's going to get worse." So there's also that idea. But in the midst of all this discussion, back to what you said, it is not just like, oh, because they support the death penalty, then, oh, we have to kill at every point. We have people who have been in prison, condemned criminals who have been in prisons for years, or at the end of the day, they are not executed until the governor signs off the actual execution. So back to the Kiri prison, the maximum prison interview. I would say very ambitious because I told the controller that, please, I want to see the gallows where the actual execution takes place. And he laughed and he was like, that's not going to happen. So I thought maybe it was more like personal. I'm like, oh, I don't have to take my phone or anything or record, but I just want to see what it looks like. And it's like, if he should step foot just in the building or in the section where the execution takes place, that I'm going to see like press men, calls from human rights activists, calls from the government, from the governor, from Abuja, which is like the capital of Nigeria. And that shows you that, okay, you want to carry out execution, and they will think, and then the condemned criminals will be frantic, thinking someone is about to be executed. That just shows you that, despite the fact that it's in the constitution, there are still bodies and organizations and people that are still fighting the system or policy. Oh, that's the question.
Thanks for your coming and your presentation. I'm so happy to see two Nigerians. I worked 2 years in Nigeria, in Naira, and I liked it because I was there with my family, with 2 kids. And later, 1 year, I worked in Ghana, very close to Accra, Regilme University, Pentecost Church in Atomic region, you know. And not weekly, but we went in the church and to introduce with the members and talk about different topics. And that's why I know West Africa, not very well, but it's okay. And Africans were not, just as a kind of reflection, Africans were not Muslim and Christian. They had their own values and local religion in the past. They were converted by slavery. And in past, and especially in Badar, except you are very close to Lagos side, from Badar with Brazil and others, maybe more than 400 years ago. And later slavery passed from Badar, Brazil to
13 colonies and others. So the other one, Nigeria has very strong and unique ethnic groups like Yoruba, left side to Lagos, or north side Hausa, and Igbo side from Goodluck Jonathan, our president. And dialogue and Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo, and especially dialogue was perfect within Yoruba groups. They succeeded. And I have many Yoruba students at the university. I know that their parents from different religions, even in Ramadan, they mother is preparing their meals, and later Sunday go to the church, etc. They succeeded. When I was in University of Birmingham, and one research group, they went to the Nigeria, and they prepare a research, and their question was around more than 500. And especially focused on the Yoruba to understand how they come together and create this dialogue as a success and as an example to the world, even to other countries or even to South Africa. And the third one is, it's my idea, because I was there, Eurocentric theory will not solve your problem. It will not bring peace to Nigeria. I know it from my major is international economics. So far, I taught this course in different continents, in Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. I had many Russian students, and later UK and others. Mostly, this story was for developed countries. It doesn't work for Africa and global south. And that's why, especially the theories of social construction by Peter Berg, Thomas, or extant behaviors, it's about different societies. And the last one is, it is not easy to define Islam and Muslims. For example, most of the Muslims don't accept Boko Haram members as Muslim because they kill people and kidnap girls and did many violence. They are evil according to most Muslims. So it is not easy to define and to focus on this kind of topics. Even today, for example, other countries, I don't want to mention their names, they have many different problems. And from the other side, if you look at them, you will say, okay, they are Muslim or Islamic countries. Yeah. So this is just reflections according to my experience. I was in Nigeria 2 years, Ghana 1 year, in South Africa a few times, more than maybe 6 months. And just I want to share with you by getting more information from your presentation. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your engagement and conversations in this panel. Thank you so much.